Let me begin. One of the panelists is on his way here. He had to go to the car. So he'll walk in and by that time we'll introduce him again. My name is Jim Gilmartin, and I'm president of Greater Estero. Our organization really serves as Estero's trusted source of community information and progress. Given our low elevation of about just 13 feet above sea level, climate change is not a distant threat. It's in our back door. It's a pressing reality that requires immediate attention and action. And here's my tonight we'll discuss important topics, including the impacts of climate change, the strategies for improving water quality, advancing municipal environmental sustainability, and enhancing community education and engagement. We're privileged to have an esteemed panel. These are super guys, and Jenny Morris, who you'll hear from her. First, we have Matt DePaolis. He's a policy director for the Sanibel-Captiva Conservancy Foundation. Jenny, of course, is a second-year master's student in environmental science at FGCU, who is very passionate about environmental issues. Captain Codty Pierce, the Calusa Waterkeeper, and Mike Savarese, professor, Department of Marine and Earth Sciences at FGCU. Over the next hour or so, our panel will address key questions. If you have a question, please write it on the Post-it notes on your seat. If you don't want to use it, you can still keep the pen. It's okay. Please write on the Post-it note and pass it to the end of the row. And somewhere down, see the fellow in the purple shirt, he'll pick them up about a half hour or so into the program. And then we will try to get the panel to answer as many questions as time allows. We've got this going till about 2 hours or so. So if it starts to really run over and people are really excited and you all want to stay, we'll stay with you. It's up to you, okay? We sincerely appreciate FGCU's Water School hosting this meeting. They've done it before several times, actually. So they're really into supporting the community. And there's a special thanks to Dr. Greg Tolley, the professor of marine science and dean of the Water School at FGCU, for moderating our discussion tonight. Dr. Tolley has over 2 decades of experience in coastal environmental research and aquatic resource conservation. He has published work on marine ecology and freshwater inflows to estuaries. His leadership roles at FGCU included the chair of the Department of Marine and Ecological Sciences and director of the Coastal Watershed Institute, making him an invaluable guide for today's conversation. So, I'm going to now ask Greg to come up. So why don't you welcome Greg to the stage?
And if you can't find enough pens out there, look in Jim's pocket. He still has about 100 left over from the last meeting. So I want to thank you all for being here on a Tuesday evening right after a holiday. I think this shows your dedication to the Greater Estero Area and the quality of life. And tonight we're here to talk about climate change and how it impacts both of those. We have an esteemed group of panelists here tonight with us, and I've got a few questions excuse me, to ask them. But at the end, we'll that maybe take an hour, and then at the end we'll save time for Q&A. So again, if you just came in, if you're just joining us, grab one of those cards, grab a pen, and fill out a question. Alan will be collecting those, excuse me, and then we'll be trying to ask as many of those questions as we can at the end of the panel tonight. Excuse I wanted to start out by posing a question. And this question is to our panelists, but it's also to you in general. So think about this as we move on to other questions tonight. We're all here tonight to discuss our concerns about the impacts of climate change on the Greater Estero area. But clearly, this is not just a Florida problem. As a matter of fact, yesterday saw the kickoff of COP29. Anybody know what that is? It's the UN's climate change conference. This year it's in Baku, Azerbaijan. So this is a global issue. And 197 countries and the European Union are there represented, including the US. Yet on Friday, the New York Times reported that incoming President Donald Trump has just prepared an executive order to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement. It's the second time he will have done that. He did it on his first term. I don't mean to make a political statement here at all, but my question is, given the fact that we're here tonight, how do we elevate the conversation so that the initiatives begun at the grassroots level, at the community and county level, for example, gets the attention of the people in Washington, regardless of their political party? Climate should not be a partisan thing. It should be part of the environment that everybody cares about and treasures. So I want you to think about that, what we can do to translate oftentimes what we think is really, really good grassroots efforts here with a lack of maybe a tone deafness sometimes in Washington, again, regardless of party. So think about that. All right, I want to start with the panelists here. And Codty, I think I want to direct this one to you. You're the lucky man here. But what pressing climate change and warming issues threaten the environment of quality of life in Greater Estero area?
Well, thank you, Greg. I'd like to first start with, I apologize if I have to clear my throat. I do have a frog in my throat, so I'll do my best to be as clear and precise as possible. When we start discussing, what are the climate changes and impacts and trying to rate this on a severity or a priority level to address some of the challenges that we're experiencing here in Estero Bay, I think the first thing that comes up has to do with temperature. The temperature is going to answer both parts of this question, but temperature is driving a higher sea level. So sea level rise on a routine basis. Temperature is also contributing to bacteria growth. So some of you guys may be familiar with our routine FIB sampling, which is fecal indicator bacteria. These bacteria, when we culture them inside of the lab, we have to grow them in an incubator for 24 hours. The temperature in which we are incubating these bacteria in order to read samples is almost the same ambient temperature that we're starting to experience during the summer seasonal periods here in Southwest Florida. So when we start to take on, this major question, we can really relate temperature to almost all of the issues outside of direct human impact, i.e. development, destruction of wetlands. So I think the thing that we need to address and continue to be observant of is this temperature increase. As the climate is starting to warm, we are being faced with water quality challenges. We are being faced with inundation challenges that come from the Gulf. And it's something that unfortunately we still haven't quite figured out how to mitigate moving forward. So that's my main answer. That's the one that I'd like to stick with. And I'd like people to realize temperature is going to cause us quite a bit of problems moving forward. So.
And Codty, you mentioned the E. coli, the coliform bacteria is something that's an indicator of health, water health, drinking water health. There's also an interesting relationship between blue-green algae and temperature as well. As temperatures go up, they tend to select for greater reproduction of the blue-green algae. And of course, we know those of you who live Sanibel or up and down the Calusa River, that's something that people have been looking at a great deal. It's one of these harmful algal blooms that can cause human health effects as well. Any of our other panelists, Jenny, Matt, Mike?
Codty made a good point, and I also want to talk about as temperature increases, we also have to think about our wetlands. As these places dry up, a lot of times the species that are in these areas are going to suffer. If they lose their habitat, we're going to see a decrease in biodiversity. I'm sure we all enjoy going to the different mangroves, going to the swamps and seeing these species. So we have to think about how climate change is also going to affect the species in these areas.
And Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. And people can hear me through the microphone? Sounds like it's working. Good, thanks. Yeah, both good comments. Temperature is the ultimate driver of our problems. Codty mentioned a few, Jenny as well. The problem that I'm sort of fixated on, I think what I would put as my highest priority is what's happening to sea surface temperatures. We're all conscious of, the days are getting warmer. We don't have frosts in the winter. The nighttime lows are higher. We've had, I don't know how many consecutive days this year of heat index days over 95 or over 100. That's something that's tangible that we can experience and be discomforted by. But the warming of the oceans is also very, very serious, particularly the warming of the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, we've lived through now 5 hurricanes since Ian in 2022, and look at the devastation they threw our way. And so much of that is related to the fact that the Gulf of Mexico is remarkably warm. It's actually warming twice as fast as the global ocean. So if you compare the Gulf of Mexico's temperature trajectory against the average for the entire ocean system for the planet, we're warming at twice that rate. And if you look at the characteristics of all of the storms that have harmed us, there's another one brewing in the Western Caribbean, soon to be Sarah, I believe, soon to be Sarah. All of the devil nuisance makers have originated and entered the Gulf and intensified rapidly and caused the problems up and down the Florida Gulf Coast. So Codty also had mentioned sea level rise. Sea level rise will be a slow and accelerating progressive exacerbator as sea level goes up. The storm surge that we experienced will sit on top of that. I did some math. If Hurricane Ian's surge occurred in 1990, okay, it would have been about 9 to 10 inches lower than it was. So we've had an extra 10 inches of surge height in Ian in 22 than we would have had in 1990. Nuisance flooding, you've also heard about it as sunny day flooding. That's going to be a more serious problem as we move forward, as the high tides get higher and will be aggravated by seawater incursions on just normal sunny days without the impact of storms. So for me, I think that's probably the biggest priority.
Yeah, I think all those answers did a really good job of highlighting the fact that temperature is this issue we're dealing with, but it's the knock-on effects from temperature in the ways that we do think about them, with the sea surface temperatures rising and more energy being available for storms. That's an immediate threat of temperature, but it's also the direct result of, or it's the direct impact to these rising sea levels. As the water gets warmer, it takes up more space. That contributes to rising oceans in a way that might not be immediately apparent. It's ways that if you're not bathed in climate science, you might not even consider that warmer air holds more water. So when we do get rainstorms, they're more of a deluge than they otherwise would be. And if you're going from drought conditions into these heavy rainstorms, not necessarily in Florida, but in other parts of the country and the world that are experiencing that, then the ground can't retain any of that water when it's falling. So you have more floods, you have more mudslides, you have all these knock-on effects. And then there's impacts that we don't fully understand in how some of our ocean currents are shutting down as the heat temperature is changing in the ocean, and what that eventual effect will be to the overall global atmosphere. So I think whether we're talking about hypoxic events in the Gulf because the oxygen in the water just isn't there for the species that need it anymore, to these larger climate models that are shifting in ways we don't fully understand, temperature really is at the base of all of that.
If I could just touch on one other thing, we're trying to simplify a single answer, on severity again, on what our issues are here. But as we experience increased amounts of higher temperatures, we're actually exponentially using more resources. So the higher the temperatures are, the more AC areas that we need, the more power we need to produce. We're using more carbon-based, fuel sources. So unfortunately, we are experiencing the consequences that is driven by human-based influences. But at the same time, in order for us to accommodate, we are still utilizing the same things that got us here into this situation. So it is a multifaceted question to try to answer. But I just wanted to make sure that we understand, that we are part of the problem here. And we need to think outside of the box on how we accomplish and accommodate mankind moving forward as we adapt to these changes.
I think that's a great point too. And I want to make sure that also we don't minimize the other impacts that we're dealing with this problem. Just because we're talking about temperature a lot, that doesn't mean ocean acidification is not an issue. That's directly tied to the amount of carbon that we're releasing into the atmosphere as well. So there are all these other host of issues, but I think climate's the big one, or temperature's the big ones.
Very good. Thank you, panelists. Codty, I'm going to field this one toward you as well. What are the sources of water pollution in our community?
Okay. I think that's an excellent question. So what are the sources of water pollution inside of our community? Simple answer, man. So, we have a real problem with nutrients. So there's a nutrient impairment issue, mostly coming from organics and inorganic nitrogen. So if we look at something like the Florida Department of Environmental Protection's BMAP, so Basin Management Action Plan, which is the platform that's put in place to try to mitigate and restore a lot of our estuaries, the primary source of nutrient loading coming into the Caloosahatchee is 80% of that nitrogen is coming from inland Florida, from agriculture. So this is something that's a little bit of a challenge, but you couple that with the coastal communities, with our influence from inorganics of fertilizers. You have dog waste, you have grass clippings, you have the die-off of natural organisms that are contributing to this. It's nutrients at the end of the day, whether it's leaky infrastructure systems, it's runoff from our developments. This is the primary issue that is starting to cause a lot of water issues for us here in Southwest Florida.
Any of our other panelists, Matt?
Yeah, I think that nailed it. There's a lot of conversation around this issue, especially down here, and it really stems when I'm engaging in these conversations is a desire for people to point a finger at an easy target that happens to not be related to their industry. So you have developers pointing at agriculture saying it's ag pollution that's doing all the damage, and you have farmers who are pointing at developers saying, well, it's all of these leaky septic tanks that were installed, so we need to clean up that before we can start to talk about these other issues. And really, it's all of this happening in concert. It's agriculture, it's septic systems, it's your lawn that you're applying nutrient-based fertilizers to, it's the heavy irrigation that we're putting on sod to make sure it stays green, that's passing all the other nutrients that are on those lawns into these water bodies. So when all of these things are happening in concert, then we're seeing the effect that these nutrient fertilizers, these nutrient sources that are great at growing plants on land are also great at growing algae and harmful plants in the aquatic environments when they get there. So we really need to be thinking about these issues in concert, what we can do holistically to stem the flow of these nutrients first and foremost, and then figure out solutions from there on out.
Speaking of stemming the flow, I like to tell my students, I think there are two existential threats in South Florida right now. The first is climate change. The second is population growth. I don't have the data after the recent hurricanes. That might change things. But before the recent hurricanes, we still have about 1,000 people moving to Florida per day. And that puts tremendous stress on our infrastructure. It changes land use. It changes whether we have agriculture or wetlands or condominiums or, and I'm not saying development's a bad thing at all, but we need to be very, very responsible in terms of how we live on the environment as we move forward, because the numbers right now are just overwhelming, and it's a moving target that's hard to keep up with. Mike Savarese, I'd like to direct this one to you. What climate change and warming threat mitigating projects would you like to see implemented? And also, could you explain just largely to me here, but also the group here, the difference between mitigation and adaptation?
Yeah, sure. The difference between adaptation and mitigation, I think, is relevant to the teaser question you started out with. I'm not sure we're talking about the teaser question at this moment, but maybe later on. But adapting to climate change is relatively easy to deal with. I think it's basically adapting to climate change means recognizing where our vulnerabilities are to those drivers, and then bolstering our resilience to those vulnerabilities. So we know the coast is vulnerable because the dune system isn't quite as developed here. Maybe we know that this particular community is more susceptible to daytime high temperatures because there's not enough shade space, green space. We can put adaptation measures in place to combat those kinds of problems, okay? But adaptation only works for a while, right? I think you'll find, and I will argue maybe in the second part of this question, that the reason why we've suffered so severely from storms subsequent to Ian along the coast is because we weren't able to adaptively manage that problem quickly enough to put in the protections that we needed before the next storm hit. So at some point, adaptation is just not sustainable. And adaptation just treats the symptomology. It's like you've got the flu, you're stuck with the flu, there's no way you're going to get rid of it, but you can reduce your temperature, you can take a decongestant. That's what adaptation to climate is really all about. What's critical, though, is mitigating climate change. In other words, trying to slow it down, reverse it, change its direction, so that we don't realize the excessive impacts we may experience as we move into the future. Okay, we need to adapt now when adaptation still works, and work to mitigate the problem so that we're not in a situation where we're trying to adapt to something that's unadaptable. I guess that's it, kind of in a nutshell. And that's a difficult thing because, again, and Greg's teaser question at the beginning is probably an hour-long discussion on its own, but it's easier for Estero to adaptively manage its problems. It's easier for Fort Myers Beach to adaptively manage its problems. But how does it make an impact on mitigation? It's much more difficult because, you're just a little fish in a giant pond that is the planet. So, but the original question was, what was the original question?
Well, that was a great answer.
It was a great answer to something. I'm not sure what.
So what threat mitigating projects would you like to see implemented? And I think the term mitigating there is used pretty loosely. So I think adapting would also fall under that.
Yeah. And, the irony is that I read the question. These aren't impromptu questions. We were, these questions were seated with us in advance, not to reveal any sneakiness here, and apparently when I thought about this question, I was thinking about adaptation and I was not thinking about mitigation. So I'm not sure if I have a good answer for the mitigation side, but how we might adaptively manage the problems differently. I have a lot of opinions on that. And I think communities have some control over how that happens. Am I allowed to answer that question?
Yes.
So a quick anecdote. I don't want to take too much of your time, but back in 2022, before Ian came and did its thing, the water school put a concerted effort together to put together a research program to basically map the coast and to look at the coast and determine where the vulnerabilities were going to be when that storm finally brought storm surge to our shores, right? We haven't had storm surge here since Donna, really, 1960, and now we've had 5 surge events in 3 years. And so we started this program. We acquired some instruments. We hired some people. We got a lot of grant money, and we started mapping the coast, and Mother Nature wasn't all that willing to wait a little bit longer for us to finish the preliminary work. But in September, Ian hit, and we've been monitoring the effects of Ian and the subsequent effects of those other storms as a way of revealing those vulnerabilities and how resilience might be approached. That's a long way of introducing my point, and that is to adapt, at least along the coast, to sea level rise and storminess. We need to think about resilience in a different way. We've been dealing with resilience as sort of a patchwork. Ian came in, let's make sure Mount Lachey is up and running. Let's make sure the bridges are up to Sanibel, and so on and so forth. Let's take FEMA's money and build emergency berms. But there needs to be a sustainable insight in the way that's done. And there are ways that can be done. And I have 1,000, if not 1,000, at least a few ways to suggest that. I'm not sure we want to take up time for that, but there are ways of managing dune systems that are more sustainable than we've been managing them. Do you realize the berm that was installed along Lee and Collier County for exorbitant cost, no doubt? It was put in, but without any vegetation. Okay, so it's like building a sandcastle on the beach and expecting it to be there when you come back the next day, right? There's no concerted planning. Had that berm been planted, okay, we probably would have some of it left. And in essence, by the time Debbie arrived earlier this summer, the berm was mostly gone. Okay, emergency berms from FEMA are supposed to last 5 years. It lasted less than 2. Okay, and Helene and Milton took it out the rest of the way. Now, Southwest Florida has plants ready to be planted on a berm that no longer exists. Okay, so that's just wasteful and unconcerted planning. There are these structures called hybrid dunes, and I'm quite passionate about this. A dune works really well under normal storm conditions. It dissipates the wave energy and serves as a fortress wall, okay? But if that wall is damaged because the wave and surge is too great, it gets destroyed, and then that water comes into the community behind it, into the streets of Fort Myers Beach, in further into Estero Bay and influencing parts of Estero. A seawall is designed as an ultimate structure to counteract those forces. There are ways to design hybrid dunes that behave like dunes during normal conditions, but then when the dune is lost, the interior seawall or more hardened structure is revealed and provides that protection after the dune is gone. And for some reason, that concept has not caught on here in Southwest Florida. So those are just two examples of how adaptation for resilience can be done differently. How we can mitigate as a community, maybe we'll leave that for later.
That goes back to the first question.
So I stopped talking.
Yeah. Matt, you and your Sanibel-Captiva Conservation Foundation, known for a long time to be stewards of the environment and helping to make Sanibel different in terms of the way people live on the landscape there. What's your view on adaptation on Sanibel?
Yeah, this is a question that we're dealing with every day. That, like was mentioned, Sanibel did a lot of great work back around its incorporation with the Sanibel Plan. The forefathers of the town were amazingly forward-thinking when they were looking at this land that we had and saying, what can we do to ensure that this is protected for future generations? And that's really the question that many more of our decision making needs to go through in Florida, in this country, and frankly around the world. We need to be considering how this decision that we're making on the ground today is going to impact future generations. And that goes further into the question of adaptation and mitigation. So Sanibel saw that the natural resources of the island were what was drawing people to it and what was also at risk from the development pressures coming from larger Lee County. So they wrote a plan that protected 70% of the island for conservation. It imposed stringent regulations around native plantings, around natural systems, and how we could protect those, while also encouraging development, while allowing people to build on the island, to bring in businesses, to bring in this community. And they're still reaping the benefits today, as we're now seeing that the business community is thriving, the real estate market is thriving on the island. So we have all these benefits that are a direct result of protecting nature. And then on top of that, we're seeing these secondary benefits today of dealing with these larger storms, of dealing with this increased pressure from these natural systems. Suddenly we have natural systems that are also protecting the inhabitants, residences, and businesses of that island. It's much better to have a wetland and a natural dune system and a mangrove fringe in between you and storm surge than it is to just have one seawall that's going to get overtopped and deal with the repercussions of that. So I think that we're still in this place where there was not everything that we are dealing with today that could be forethought of back in the 70s when these programs were and when this plan was being enacted. So we're figuring out how to adapt an island. How do we adapt our business and residential communities to be able to capitalize on the natural systems that we already have in place that are providing these protections, but are also not fulfilling everything we need to ensure that these communities are going to be existing far into the future. So these are the adaptation plans that we're thinking of, and there's a lot of things that are novel and pressing the ground, like having a hybrid dune structure is something that's being talked about but hasn't been enacted yet. And then you have to figure out complicated workarounds to say, well, we protect natural dunes in the Sanibel plan. How do we incorporate a hardened structure into a natural dune and still consider that to be in line with this conservation plan that was set out years ago? There's more straightforward methods to adaptation. Let's see how many buildings we can raise up on the island. How do we support a community that wants to elevate their structures so that we're not having these massive rebuildings necessary every time we have a storm come through? What building materials can we use in our adaptation process so that we're not having to rip out an entire floor's worth of drywall every time we get a few inches of water in the house? And these are questions that one way or another need to be answered, and they're either going to be answered because we're able to put this forethought in the beginning and come up with an answer, or they're going to be answered because you've torn out your drywall for the 5th time in one season and you're just getting sick of this. So I think that there's these adaptation questions that are naturally arising, and we're able to think about them in new and creative ways in conjunction with the natural systems that we have. But the mitigation question is also one that's really pressing, and it really is at the forefront of this idea of what are we doing for future generations? How are we doing this in a forward-thinking way that will protect us for the next 50 years, the next 100 years, and allow us to enjoy this community, this place that we love, and allow our kids to enjoy the place that we love. And it's a really sticky situation because mitigation is not something, it was touched on, that if Estero engages in perfect mitigation for everything they do, it's not going to change the threat of climate change. It's not going to have an outsized impact. And it might, if they're the only ones doing it, it's not going to actually have any impact on the future of this area. But I think that if we as affluent communities in Southwest Florida who are at the forefront of the climate crisis, we and our neighbors are the ones who are experiencing home loss, business loss every year with all these increasing storms. If we're not ones who can think creatively and come up with solutions to show what mitigation could look like, how we can build adaptation and mitigation into a community going forward, and what we can do to set a standard, provide pilot projects, and really be the forefront of the mitigation movement. If it's not going to be communities like ours, then no one's going to move on it. So right now we're kind of stuck in this prisoner dilemma of everyone pointing fingers and saying, well, they're not doing it, so why should we? Well, this nation's not paying into it, so why should we? But as long as there's that us or them thought process going on, we're really just all losing. So these are conversations that we're facing on Sanibel. I know these are conversations that are going on everywhere, but I think it's really an opportunity for us to set the standard and set the stage for what the future can look like.
And, Matt, you mentioned the future, 50 to 100 years from now, the Haudenosaunee, which are part of the Iroquois Nation up in the Northeast, they define sustainability as 7 generations. That's what they think the earth should look like. And it's not just your kids and your grandkids, but 7 generations. And I don't want to leave the impression that climate change is all about sea level rise. But think what Estero, the eastern part of Estero Bay and the village of Estero would be if Black Island and Lover's Key were not there. That's the first line of defense. These barrier islands down here that generate so much in tourism dollars, like Sanibel, like Key Waden down in Naples. If these things were to be removed, breached, they no longer protect our coastline. They're really our first line of defense for all of our coastal communities. Codty, you had a comment you want to make?
I did. Thank you. And both to Mike, I think you guys gave some excellent answers, and there's not one answer to answer this question. But the 2 things that I wanted to propose is kind of an out of the box type thought is that, when we're making these ideas on how to combat some of these environmental issues, the one thing that we're not taking into account is that we have less than a century worth of data. What we know as society here in Florida does not go farther back than a century. We have some written record that came from, Spanish missionaries when they came and visited Florida. But the main reference that I wanted to propose here is that some of these big, climate change challenge questions, I think we really need to look back in time. We have the Calusa, who were the prominent people of this area for multiple thousands of years. We lack the cultural aspect of looking back through time to see a storm of a century or a mass exodus, or high sea level rise. There's science that proves, that there is this need in order to be transit, between the coast and inland. But the second thought to this is the way that they are able to establish civilizations. Prioritization on inland areas. If they did build on the coast, everything was rounded. They had impervious surfaces, so shell mounts, can absorb a lot of the energy. And then the second thing, is following this hurricane that we just had. When we look at our coastal beaches, Mother Nature is telling us, that the coastline is made to switch. They place sand berms in areas that we go through and spend millions of dollars to move because we find it to be an inconvenience. Nature is telling us multiple times that there is an option to this. There are ways to adapt to some of the climate change. One of those, as I stated, on the impervious surfaces could apply to our coastal communities with the homes that are raised. We saw after Ian, most of the homes that survived the immense amount of storm inundation were those that were raised from the ground and didn't have a major amount of infrastructure built underneath the stilt home. So just wanted to pose that as kind of an out of the box thing, but we do have examples here, and I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards.
One indication, I always like driving up and down the beach, one indication of how dynamic our landscape is. take a drive up the near the intercoastal waterway on the east coast, the west coast of Florida, and look at how many passes are named Blind Pass, New Pass, Hurricane Pass. These are all recent historical names that have been given to a dynamic coastline here. When we have a good citizens group here tonight that are interested in their community, that are interested in the environment and the climate especially, can you give us some examples, Pat? I'll maybe start with you, Matt. But what kinds of community participation are really pivotal for the transformative changes that we're talking about, the coordination, the difference in scale? And can you highlight any successful examples? And of course, Sanibel in many ways is kind of the pillar of success. It has been at least for 50 years.
Yeah, I think Sanibel is a great example of what a community that's united behind a shared set of values can do and can accomplish, because really governance starts at home. If you have a dedicated group of citizens that are engaging with your local government, you can usually get things through, and people will listen to you when you're organized and when you have a clear value. So I think that's really reflected in the Sanibel plan. There was this environmental ethos that was encapsulated in the land use plan, and there's been a staunch transfer of leadership between that community that puts a high price on that value, and it hasn't shifted yet. So I think that this is something that is constantly reaffirmed. You see as leadership changes throughout the city, there's always people who are worried about that natural ethos and how the next iteration of government is going to be protecting that as well. So I think this speaks to the importance of organization within your own community. But I think that there are steps that communities can take, whether it's on the mitigation or the adaptation front. I think as far as adaptation goes, it's really important to identify the weaknesses in your community. If there's a certain place where water inundation is coming and it's a known element to the community, then there should be advocacy for hardening that area, and there should be advocacy for using natural systems as well as possible. If there's an issue where coastal water is coming in, maybe that's an opportunity for a living shoreline project. Maybe that's an opportunity for mangrove plantings. These are just examples, but it's important to think in an organized fashion, direct your efforts, and champion natural solutions whenever possible. They're not always going to be possible, but when they are, what we've seen is that they're able to self-replicate. They're able to utilize a lot of these, I'm hesitant to even say engineered, but these solutions that are provided by nature for the problems that nature's been dealing with for thousands of years. The best engineer is nature. So if we can capitalize on the designs that are already present rather than trying to come up with our own, they go a lot further. And same, and even more so for mitigation. I think, as was mentioned before, mitigation is not something that, it's certainly something that can be done. Everyone can take stock of their own lives and look at how they're impacting the community around them and try to tamp down their own water pollution, their own energy usage. But when we see the real gains from mitigation efforts, it's when they're being done in concert. So there's opportunities to go to your local government and say, hey, we need more solar charging stations, we need car charging stations, we need shared use path, we need public transportation options that'll get people out of the cars, we need more shade, so that we're not experiencing the onset effects from all the heat that we're generating now. We need asphalt to not be the #1 impervious surface in our community. So there's questions that you can ask of your fellow community members, and a lot of this starts with taking a good, honest look at your area around you, trying to identify some of these either hotspots for pollution or weak spots in your community defenses against the changing climate, and start there.
You know, you mentioned nature-based solutions, and there was an interesting paper that came out about 6-7 years ago that demonstrated that oyster reefs are actually able to keep up with moderate sea level rise as a natural protector. So take an oyster to lunch.
As opposed to eating one for lunch.
Codty, Jenny, any comments?
Yeah. So Matt executed that perfectly. You know, when we're talking about active community participation, I think one of the most pivotal, I think one of the most pivotal roles that we as a community can serve is, the communications between our elected officials. Now, that may sound like a broken record at this point, but we elect these folks that are supposed to represent us. So if we start to prioritize these initiatives that we want to be heard on, I think that that's probably the greatest source of change that we can implement. The second aspect of that is that, our climate, the ecosystems that we have here, every aspect of it pertains to our economy. So whether it's your property values, or if you're in the service industry, if you're a part of the tourism aspect, if you're a commercial fisherman, a recreational fisherman, almost everything we do all pertains to the environment. So, if we can start to voice these concerns, start to get our elected officials to take us seriously, it's the one thing that's sustaining all of us, whether that's your recreational time or your pocketbook that's speaking. I think all of us can find common ground on this. And I was really trying to find, a good example of an area that can lead or has led an initiative like this. I should have known that Matt would cover Sanibel. That's kind of obvious. So my second choice is going to be addressing Crystal River. So Crystal River is a place that some of you may have heard of. It's up on the west coast of Florida, just north of Tampa. Crystal River is one of the few communities that acknowledged how important their natural resources are and prioritized this area. So that came in the form of first acknowledging the problem. Excellent point. They acknowledged that they have a nutrient problem. What were the ways that they could fix it? Septic to sewer conversions. In addition to that, the seagrass is what contributes to all aspects of the economy there. They prioritize seagrass restorations. Now, Crystal River is a much smaller demographic than an area like us that's pushing 1 million people. Same thing surface area wise, but the same ideological parameters on how they were able to implement restoration and more importantly, sustainability moving forward has already started to pay dividends. So not only do they have a continuously increasing economy, they also have real world provable restoration success, which I think is very inspiring to us. So there are ways that I think that we could have this happen here. I think the difference is that, again, we are a much larger area. We're a bigger melting pot of a lot of different influences, but this all goes back to the elected officials. They're the key ones, the key folks that can implement change. That change has to come at, the suggestion of us as voters. So that's my answer to that.
Cody, I think you made a good point. I just wanted to say that there can be no real change if we don't have proper policies in place. We can all make changes in our small communities, in our homes, but if there's no policies to force people to make these changes, for more people to make these changes, climate change is just going to get worse and worse. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's an important element that sometimes gets lost when you're talking about the science. As a scientist, sometimes I forget how important it is. I advocate for the science, but there has to be somebody that can advocate for positive change as well. And that's where policy comes into place.
Craig, could I add
yeah,
something?
please.
I don't know how we're doing on time. I'm listening to the previous comments for this question has me thinking. I think, Sanibel is a prime example. Probably your Crystal River is a good example of what I'm thinking. I'm thinking about Cedar Key. These are communities that have worked well in a collaborative way with the layperson citizenry, local government, and NGOs, organizations that are committed to environmental conservation or preservation or of one kind or another. And that seems to be something we may lack, this cooperative sense here in Southwest Florida. A lot of you probably are familiar with the effort to try to organize what was called at one point the Southwest Florida Regional Resiliency Coalition. The idea was bringing in 15 jurisdictions, cities, counties, the tribes, and some other assorted groups to work cooperatively towards dealing with climate effects. And one of the pervasive opinions among those jurisdictions, right, the governments, was that we don't want NGOs involved. NGOs are often viewed as antagonistic. Maybe they're levying suits against government, litigating government. But I think there's a way to bring NGOs, the science community. I mean, here at the water school, we can provide the resources. We're not supposed to be advocates, but we can provide hopefully the factual information that's necessary. And if not, we can get it, or we can, do the work to make that happen. If there's a way of cooperatively bringing citizenry and NGOs that have some sort of financial base to capitalize on and get government to allow for that collaboration, that would be a good thing. I don't know, I'm looking to Codty and Matt. Were those the situations? I know Sanibel seems to get along with everybody.
I'm glad we have that appearance. No, I think you do highlight a good point, and I think that and the category of NGO is such a broad category, and I think that you have NGOs that are much more antagonistic and are very litigious and excitable and will get up in arms very often. And I think those are the ones that tend to stick out in government agencies' minds from their past dealings with NGOs. But I don't think that just being an NGO necessarily presupposes engagement with these issues. It certainly doesn't from where Coddy's sitting. I think what's been really helpful in my career and certainly in SCCF's positioning of themselves in the room as a science-based organization. Because if you are coming, whether you're an academic or an NGO or a government official or a private citizen, and you have the science to back up what you're saying, then people will listen to you, is what I found. When you start making wild claims and hyperbolic accusations and pointing fingers and raising the volume in the room, that's when people kind of check out and your message gets muddled based on the way that you're trying to deliver it. But when I walk into a room and I have a stack of scientific papers with me and I have a biologist on one side and an economist on the other, and we're presenting to an interested group of people, whether they're citizens or government employees, then they tend to listen when you have that objective reasoning to back that up. So I think that it's not so much who the message is coming from insofar as how the message is being presented. But it is a hurdle to get over if people have been burned before and they're starting from a place of, we don't want NGOs in the room or at the table.
Yeah. And I think, part of being a good solution-minded organization is trying to find common ground. So if you're working on a solution, you don't want to necessarily go into direct opposition, some type of confrontation when we're working with these groups. So that means that we have to become fluent. You have to find common ground. So what we try to do, to Matt's point, is come up with an economic survey, because as we all know, money is the one thing that transcends all, different languages, across the world. So if we can make this economic, correlation between the environment and the community and the impacts of this, I think it's one way that we can try to find common ground to move forward. But the way that I would end the question, because you guys made great points, is that we try to do this and facilitate a happy conversation to find central ground. But at the end of the day, we will find out. We will find out that, these environmental problems, whether or not we're able to find a solution, it's not going to affect just me, it's going to affect everyone. So I think that that's something that weighs above all of our heads, and it's something to set aside, a prideful type of endeavor, because the bigger picture is all of us. So I think that, through continued workings and communication, that there has to be a way to find a solution moving forward, because it's not just our livelihoods, it's the economic impact and it's the longevity of what we know here as a coastal community. So we have to come up with an agreement and find a way to move forward, no matter what it takes. We have to. So.
Thank you. Jenny, I'm going to pitch this one to you. You're a student here at Florida Gulf Coast University. I've never talked to you about it, but you might be a teacher one day as well. Have you thought about that?
I thought about it.
Yeah.
I'm thinking
I can
about
talk
it.
you out of it if you want. But can you discuss for us a little bit what role education, especially K through 12 education, can play in addressing the effects of climate change here in Southwest Florida?
Well, firstly, there's no doubt that climate change is happening. So I feel like there is a need for climate change in schools. Firstly, if we don't teach it, wait, sorry, I'm a little nervous. Okay, firstly, if we don't teach it, a lot of the next generation won't be able to assist in the climate change issues that we have now. We need people to know about it. I think about during the summer, I worked with a few students that came to visit FGCU, and a lot of them had never even walked through the Cypress Dome, and they really enjoyed that. And they they didn't even know a lot of these things exist. They had never seen it. They had never seen the plants. They had never seen the trees. And a lot of times, if people don't know about something, they can't protect it. They can't find it useful. So if they don't appreciate what they have, and if they don't know, okay, I need to change what I'm doing and I need to tell my parents about it, because a lot of them, their parents don't even know climate change. They don't know how to mitigate it, how to adapt to it. So if we start with the students and if we start with the kids from K through 12, we'll be able to have people that can help with these issues in the future. A lot of people don't go on to college. So we have to start with the beginning. Because a lot of times, yes, we're taught this in college and we're forced to, well, not forced, I chose. But
That's okay. We hear that a lot. Yeah.
a lot of times they're pushed to take environmental classes, biology classes, but a lot of times people won't take it. People don't take it. So we have like business majors. Not everyone is going to take a science course. Not everyone is going to learn about climate change in the future. So we have to start with the kids. So.
Jenny, let me ask you a question here too. My sense of it is that your generation is much more thoughtful about issues related to the environment and climate than mine ever was. What's your reading on that?
I think about my cohort. There's only about 15 to 20 of us in my cohort in the Masters of Environmental Science, and everyone that I've been around is very much into environmental issues, into climate change. Every time I look on my phone, there's someone asking me to sign a petition to stop this and stop that, to protect the turtles, to protect the mangroves. So I definitely agree. I'm not saying our generation is better, but we're definitely much into environmental issues.
Well, that makes my generation hopeful. Well, I want to thank the panelists for these great questions, but what I'd like to do is open it up to some of you. So many of you have kind of passed your questions on to Alan over here. And so if I get any of these questions wrong, it's because of his handwriting. But I think there's some really, really good questions here we'd like to see if the panelists can address. And the first one I want to start off with is actually the teaser question that I began with a while ago. We're here tonight to talk about climate change. This is the week of COP29. So 197 countries and the European Union are in Baku, Azerbaijan tonight to talk about the global problem of climate change. And yet in this country at the top levels of leadership, sometimes at state, sometimes at national level, we don't send a consistent message on climate change, whether it's through policy or enforcement or regulations. How can we bridge that gap? So what you're doing here at the grassroots level, at the local level, is heard and acted upon at that level. Any of our panelists want to handle that?
That's a lot. Wow.
Cody's like, why on earth would I answer that?
I don't even know where to start on that. I think it's first, it's almost an acknowledgement, us and the US, we're the largest consumers of just about every resource that's known. Trying to, when we're talking about all 50 states, trying to let folks that are dealing with drought in the Midwest or rampant fires out in the western end of the US, trying to find common ground, about our water quality issues or that we have flooding really doesn't resonate with most of the folks across the country because they're dealing with their own issues. The one commonality that we have here is that we are all experiencing increased amounts of environmental issues. I think it's just a realization, I think that that's one way that we can try to find more accountability and try to inspire some change out of this is that, if we look back through our written history, there is a lot that's changing. There is no more predictability with weather. There's not the consistent that we've known for quite some time. I think it's really a regional aspect, but the global aspect is that we're all hot. The polar ice caps are melting. We're dealing with a lot of change in the amount of precipitation, and I may sound like I'm preaching. I can tell by some of the looks on your faces, but this is the reality, folks, that we have more prolonged droughts. That's not just a Florida issue. It's happening out west. When we do receive rainfall, we have flash flooding. You get 2 months worth of rain in a 24-hour period. This comfort or sustainability, is one that is definitely going to be challenged moving forward. But the other thing that came to mind when you're reading the question, I'm not quite sure how to correlate it, but the US has a lot more resources than anywhere else in the world, whether it's natural resources, it's bought resources. So we are a nation and a community of utilizing that. We consume an immense amount. So, I think the way that we can move forward with trying to address this is, to Jenny's point, it starts with the next generation. Some of this stuff has been at the forefront. I found out in my professional career that most of the climate change predictions that started in 1984 were pretty spot on. The fact is that we weren't listening, and we're running out of time until we hit that point that there is no return. So I think it starts with us at home. I think it's the conversations that you have with your family, with your loved ones, with your neighbors, the way that we conduct ourselves and how we move forward. So I know I kind of beat around the bush there, but those were the points that
I like the way
came
you
up.
separated your family from your loved one.
Yeah.
But,
You never know these day and age.
any of our other panelists? Any comments? All right, let me
Wait,
move on to some questions from me.
I'm about ready to say something.
Okay.
It was a lot to process.
Yes, it's a lot. It is a lot to process. I'm an eternal optimist, and the people in the room that know me maybe recognize that. And my optimism, frankly, is wearing thin. I don't know how you affect a change in attitude across the country with respect to climate change. There is no easy answer, and frankly, I don't think we're going to change it anytime soon. And 4 years of not addressing climate effects by withdrawing from the Paris Accord, by not having necessarily scientific agencies funded to continue the work of monitoring climate change. I mean, if funding is pulled from a variety of agencies, not only won't we be talking on an international stage, but we will be basically stifling our abilities to understand climate, to battle it effectively. And if we pull funding away from federal agencies that are there to provide help for people who are suffering because of climate effects, I'm thinking specifically here about FEMA, we're handicapped yet a third way, and that is there's no way to reach out and provide people with the financial assistance to recover. So those are three very, very serious problems, right? One is not talking on an international stage because it is a global problem. Two is not fostering or encouraging further scientific investigation to understand the problem as thoroughly as possible. And the third is not helping Southwest Florida when the sixth storm surge storm heads our way, which might be next week, frankly. So how do you remain optimistic about that? I think the reason why we're all tongue-tied up here is it's for just that reason. This is a serious existential problem that most people don't think about, most people are unaware of. And Jenny's right, education's important, but if we did a bang-up job of educating K through 12ers by the time they're old enough to vote and make a difference, it's going to be too late. I mean, 2030 is just around the corner, and there were supposed to be greenhouse gas reduction targets met by 2030, which clearly is not going to happen. If you look at just the sea level curve, NOAA publishes a variety of scenarios as to what sea level is likely to do between now and 2100. There's 5 curves. They're given names like low, intermediate, low, intermediate, high, and high. And those, if you look at what sea level has been doing, we're following the worst trajectories based on data, actual empirical data that have been collected over the last 20 years. And so the existential threat, and that's just sea level rise, that doesn't deal specifically with temperature and some of the other effects. So it's a serious problem. I would tell you one way to approach it is to vote differently. Again, regardless of what your politics are about what other issues are out there in the world. Clearly, most people, the vast majority of the voting populace wasn't thinking about what the Trump administration might do with with climate as we move forward.
Yeah.
So I think it's an unanswerable question, Greg.
Yeah.
I think the answer, it's not an answer, but a strategy. I think a lot of these responsibilities are going to fall on local government, particularly if there is no financial assistance through federal agencies to help. And now more than ever, groups like Engage Estero are really, really important. I think we're going to have to contend with the problems ourselves in our own backyards and our own communities. Again, it's easier to do the adaptation piece as a small community or jurisdiction, and a lot harder to do the mitigation. But maybe enough mitigation efforts at the local level sends a message, changes the culture. You look at Miami-Dade, Broward, those South Florida counties, they are doing mitigation projects. They're addressing their carbon footprint. It may not be making a difference in terms of climate effects, but at least they're making a statement. So.
And learning from that, yeah.
Yeah.
One of the questions we have from the audience here, what, if anything, gives you hope that climate change, hope, well, let's just say regarding climate change in the future? I would say two things I can think of here tonight. You all, number one, the fact that we have citizens, concerned citizens, residents that are trying to highlight this starting in their neighborhoods, elevating it to conversations with local government, elevating that as one of the values you vote for. And I think Codty said something very important tonight. He essentially said the environment is the economy here in Florida. And so there's no Sophie's choice there. You don't have to vote for the environment or the economy. They're one and the same here. But the other thing that gives me hope is Jenny's generation. But I want to remind you all that hope is not a strategy, and hope has to be followed up with action, or we won't get where we need to be. So we still have some time. Those of us who are older in the crowd here tonight, but we're investing more and more hope, I think, in Jenny's generation. Let me go on to another question here. Science indicates that the more asphalt and concrete, i.e. developments, is linked to more heat retention and flooding and sea level rise. How can population growth be balanced with these worsening impacts? I'm going to pitch that to you, Matt.
Yeah, I think we have an issue when we talk about growth in South Florida, United States in general, in that we're talking about growth as though it is inevitable and it has to be done in the same way that it's always been done. So the number was thrown out earlier that we have 1,000 people coming to Florida every day. And the unspoken follow-up to that is each one of those 1,000 people apparently needs a single family tract home on a golf course in a place that used to be panther habitat, and we'll worry about roads and sewers later. We just got to get them all in there. And that's just not how anything needs to be. I think there's a lot of opportunities for smart development and redevelopment of the areas that we're already living in and habitating in, that don't have to pump out a bunch more asphalt and concrete and impervious surfaces into our wetlands. We can have mixed use building spaces that support our business community while also providing residences for people. Not everyone, as we're living and making our lives in Florida, needs the exact same life and residential option. And that needs to be reflected in the planning decisions that are being made by our leaders and the people who are making those planning decisions. So I think Sanibel is a really good example of this. I'm going to come back to it a lot as I'm talking, because that's where I spend a lot of my time. But we have incorporated residential and business and mixed use community spaces into the natural systems that are already at play there. And we've been reaping the benefits of that. And I think that can be done in Fort Myers and Fort Myers Beach and Greater Lee County and Estero. It just takes some creative problem solving, and it takes looking at what we have and the ability for us to use what we have in a new way that's not going to be putting a lot of excess effort into stripping away the protections that are provided by those natural systems, by those wetlands, by those pervious surfaces. There's a huge amount of knock-on effects and impacts to getting rid of wetlands. We lose aquifer access, we lose clean water, we have greater storm surge. We have all these excess impacts that are not thought about when you're sitting in a planning commission meeting. When you're sitting at the county, they're not talking about any of these effects. They're talking about, well, does it meet the plan? Does it meet the LEED plan? Can we put that many residences on this land? What are mitigations going to be? But none of this holistically is looking at really, again, what is the next generation going to look like? What is 7 generations going to look like in Florida? So unless we're answering those questions and really thinking about how do we capitalize on the space that's been used without adding further impervious surfaces, without overtaxing the transit systems that we have in place, without adding a lot of more storm sewers and septic systems and other pollutant sources into our areas, then we're just going to keep seeing these problems that are getting worse every day.
Quick one. Yeah.
Yeah, I got just a quick one, that this goes a step further. So, the state of Florida has no income tax. This is an outdated practice that the state used to solicit population when Florida was in a population deficit. So can any of you guys guess one of the best ways that, municipality can raise funds? Anybody? Property taxes, impact fees. It's hardwired into the development of areas like Southwest Florida that development is key. That is the way that people are having jobs. That's the way that the municipality is making funds off of this. So that goes right back to what he was talking about planning, areas that have already been utilized. It's starting to shift the direction in which we want to see this community move forward. We want to stop the urban sprawl. I think every one of us can give multiple examples of areas that came, blew up, used a lot of resources, and then deteriorated. Look at the strip malls along Old 41. Look at areas along, Fort Myers or south of there. There are plenty of examples that we're using an outdated system because that's the one that's paying the bills and greasing the squeaky wheel. That's part of the big picture aspect that we can look at and move forward with in order to lessen our footprint. But before that can happen, we have to acknowledge where we come from and why this is happening. Funding. I think that's the root emphasis of all of this.
There's something you said that strikes me as so horrifically ironic, and that is development is so important to raising revenue because of those property taxes. But at some point, the desire to live here may go away. And what are jurisdictions worried about more than anything else? They're worried about, I would say, the harsh realities of climate change, in fact, affecting the habitability of those neighborhoods. And so ignoring climate change and ignoring the adaptation to climate change and mitigating climate change is just going to worsen the financial impact for how those revenues are generated in the future.
Let me go on to the next question here. So regarding whether local governments and businesses are expanding jobs and careers in climate change fields, like sustainability, for example, mitigation, conservation. I'll tell you that Indeed now does an annual climate or sustainability jobs report, and the sustainability or green jobs part of that is growing at double digits, about 12 to 15%. Now, that's the good news. A lot of businesses are being more, speaking more of a mind of being more socially responsible, giving back to their communities as well. And so a lot of the bigger businesses can afford to do so. We'll have a sustainability officer, for example, or a climate officer. Government agencies have a lot of people and continue to hire people. They don't pay crap. And so it's hard to get our students to, I'm sorry if I just broke that to you, Jenny, but they don't pay a living wage here in Southwest Florida, what become a living wage. So it's hard to attract students into that as a career because they have to start so low on the pay scale. And I would say, based on what I know with hiring faculty and staff here in Southwest Florida, it's untenable. But that's what the current state is. I would say another growth opportunity and something that we're looking at is clearly as we move forward, and Mike's solution is saying, regardless of what's going on at the mitigation global or United States scale, local communities can still band together or work alone to create adaptation policies that can help them moving forward. And what I do see is a huge potential growth in mitigation, sustainability, and adaptation officers in local government. I think moving forward that local government's going to have to hire experts to give them good advice on getting a good return on investment for these adaptation strategies. And these adaptation strategies are not one size fits all. So they're going to need some really, really good education and training to do that. So I do see that as a potential growth potential. Let's see, can you foresee uniting the many climate and environmental organizations in Southwest Florida? And would it be beneficial to speak with one voice? Mike, I think you kind of touched on that with the Southwest Florida Regional Climate Coalition, right?
Yeah, I mean, the original intention of the coalition was to bring the governments, the local governments together. But nobody's really explored a coalition outside of government or a coalition of just organizations rather than local jurisdictions. I think both are, in my mind, both would be advantageous.
One audience member writes, we're replacing rocks, for example, what we call riprap in the coastal environment with for green. Will that help? I think this gets back to the hybrid or green infrastructure versus gray infrastructure.
Yeah.
Here.
Again, in an ideal situation, just having soft structures protect the coast makes the most sense. But when those soft structures are destroyed, and they will be destroyed from time to time, is there anything left behind, a vestige of protection? Which is why the hybrid concept is, in my mind, such a brilliant one. I mean, if you just put a seawall out there, and there are parts of our coastal cities that have seawalls. Sanibel has some. Fort Myers Beach has quite a few. Naples has quite a few. And you just have a seawall out there and nothing natural out in front. That seawall during normal day-to-day kinds of wave action and your kind of mellowish storms are just, those energies are going to be reflected off of those structures, and that causes the beach to go away. And in essence, you're constantly battling the need to renourish beaches. Dunes, on the other hand, provide a natural dissipatory surface. They dissipate that energy during the low times and are naturally growing and naturally dynamic and work remarkably well during the normal day-to-day conditions. The problem is a lot of communities don't have the accommodation space for dunes. Sanibel, in its foresightful planning, created accommodation space. There are actually parts of Sanibel that have multiple dune ridges. And if you look at how that particular area of Sanibel responded to the 5 storms, that area was unscathed. Okay, that's the Bowman's Beach area. The Bowman's Beach region, it's not just the park, it's a huge section of the western part of Sanibel. But there's no room to put a dune on Fort Myers Beach, right? Development, they've exceeded the coastal setback line for development. The development's right up there on the beach itself. But there could be room for a hybrid structure. So one dune ridge with something inside of it that would turn into a seawall if the dune itself was destroyed. Same is true for Naples. Parts of Naples has accommodation space for dunes, other parts don't, but hybrid dunes would fit. So the riprap, I mean, there is a hardened hybrid dune design that involves riprap at the core, but I'm not sure that's the right way to go. There's all kinds of engineering strategies. So just having riprap out on the coast is not a solution. It creates other unintended problems. But hybrid dunes, if you want to keep the cultural aesthetic that is Southwest Florida and retain that beach economy.
Thank you. Let's see, other questions moving on here. So what can be done and implemented to protect sensitive coastal regions over the next 50 years, or is it a lost cause? Jenny, you work with mangroves, right?
Yes.
Yeah, maybe give us a little perspective of what mangroves can do to coastal regions.
Okay, so probably not everyone has been to the mangroves, but I mean, we should all be aware that mangroves, first of all, they reduce storm surge. So if you've ever watched any videos that show how high the surge is before it hits the mangroves and after it comes through, you'll know that it's a total difference. First of all, I'm from the Bahamas and we went through Hurricane Dorian, and if a lot of our communities didn't have those mangroves in place, they would have been worse than they already were. So especially like during my project, I work with mangroves and I'm looking at how coarse woody debris, so all of that branches, stumps, how that impacts mangrove recruitment and colonization. So having these mangroves in place is actually very important. And there's a need for better policies on how we manage these to make sure that people are not removing them just willy-nilly. So
And there's not always accommodation space for the mangrove. So accommodation is a problem there as well. And again, Sanibel, in its foresightful brilliance, has extensive mangrove habitat on the backside through the Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge. But most communities are built on the backside, the back of a barrier island, are built right to the edge, right? And so there isn't space to put mangroves to protect the backside. The mangroves are going to help on the backside, not on the front side. So that's another problem.
And I think it's interesting to note too, you know, when those mangroves are on the backside, that's what's helping contribute to the forming of these barrier islands to begin with, right? So the backside of the mangroves is helping retain a lot of the soil for an island or coastal community in which we actually call home. But just to one further point, you know, I think one way that we can mitigate these, you know, is the way that we're trying to correspond or inhabit with the edge of the ocean. You know, I'm going to make the reference of beach renourishments, but the state of Florida is one of the largest beach renourishment projects in the entire world. We fix and move sand constantly like ants. So, you know, when this is constantly happening, back to my earlier comment on reference of what nature is showing us, when it's placing dunes, it's providing us the foliage to hold these coastal islands, but then we come along and change the topography of these coastal islands and not acknowledge the changing and shifting sands. We're the ones that are paying the price. So it's this continued endeavor of us fighting the environment and throwing money at it is what's getting us back into the same situation again.
I've got a number of questions that are coming in. I haven't read any of them yet, but to give you one that just kind of encapsulates one or more feelings in the room. And what do you say to climate deniers? So if the panel or audience were presented with undeniable proof that climate change is a tool by certain interests to deindustrialize the West, would you be open to listening to it? Mike and I listen to this all the time. It's part of the noise that we hear on climate change. And the science is, when you hear things like scientists don't agree on this, scientists are almost unanimously in agreement. Where they disagree is in the details of prediction. I tell people, in my mind, it's like a hurricane model. You know, Mike's talking about a storm that's out there. I watch storms using these models, the American and European model, starting about 2 weeks out, because we run not only the water school, but we run the Vesta Marine Field Station on Bonita Beach Road, and we also oversee the Kapnick Center down to Naples Botanical Garden. So we want to make sure that those assets are protected. I'm sure Matt and his group does similar things, probably Eric does similar things. And we can see at a certain point if something's coming our way or not. Whether it hits at Crystal River, or whether it hits at Clearwater, or whether it hits at Fort Myers Beach might be in question. But at some point, the fact that it's going to hit is not in question. We are at that point with climate change. And so don't be swayed by people who say the scientists don't agree on this. There's plenty of evidence to those people are, quite frankly, at the fringe of science. It's not what we would entertain because we read it. We have read it, we've studied it, and it just goes against what our data show. So I appreciate extra viewpoints, but we at some point in time have to agree on what is real and what the data actually says, and not continue to litigate that. Look around us, folks. I mean, look around us. So, sir. Yeah.
My name's Fred Reese. I'm a 40-year veteran of the CO2 industry. And my question is, and you know, so I have a little bit of experience. I'm also a member of the CO2 coalition, you might be familiar,
No, well, yeah.
which is not a part of the consensus. But properties of CO2 and the concentrations that are in the atmosphere right now have no causality for increasing temperature.
I would say everybody on this panel disagrees with you 100%. And I know that your industry is actually, it used to be selling liquid CO2. Yeah.
It's a discussion about science that you guys understand and agree with. And perhaps I thought we'd have a discussion tonight where people on both sides of this issue, because it is a very important issue. There's no denying that the temperature is going up.
Yeah.
It has before, it's gonna do it again. But I think what is really important here, I understand the properties of CO2. It was my business.
Mhm.
And I know for a fact that the properties of CO2 in the concentrations that exist today, less than 0.5% in atmosphere, can cause all the calamities that you folks are talking about. So it is great.
That just, the science doesn't say that. The science doesn't say that. So let's move on here. Yeah, was that your question? Yeah. Sure.
The question was framed in such a way that if you were given or shown the original agendas behind this,
Mhm.
whether or not you'd be open to that debate each slide.
No, it didn't say the agendas. It said the undeniable, it said undeniable, what was it, proof?
Perhaps
Yeah, yeah. You know, and there's,
I brought some presentations here. If anybody's interested, I'll leave them here. And you can take it if they'd like to see some good. Thanks for having me.
I mean, just to answer your question, I think that yes, if you were presented with undeniable evidence of something, I would engage with that. Just like if someone came and said, I have undeniable evidence that gravity is a theory or evolution's a theory, here, let's talk about that. But
say, yeah, behind.
at some point, it doesn't matter, because what you're doing is you're using the political agendas behind that to discredit the science. And the science is pretty clear. That's what I'm saying. So we advocate for and back the science, and people that whatever way they try to discredit the science, it's not what we see, and it's not what we've studied ourselves.
But it's the case in a modification of essentially nature, you know, the UN's talked about this for almost 100 years. The Rome published in 1970.
Yeah, I think we're really off target here. I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate other viewpoints. That's actually how science works. Science is not any one of us telling the rest of the world how to interpret the world around it. We actually conduct studies. We actually have those studies reviewed by our peers, published, widely distributed, so people from around the world can view the science we have. And oftentimes when I publish, well, almost all the time when I publish a paper, but oftentimes when we publish a paper, somebody will come out and say, well, that's completely wrong. And I'm good with that if they show me how it's completely wrong. But if they start going into conspiracy theories and trying to dispute the science itself, just saying it's not good, that's where I just can't talk about it, because I'm a scientist. I look at the data. Mike looks at the data a lot. And so this is just a distraction. No, I didn't say you in particular. Yes. Yes. Yeah, so let's see. How can we evaluate the policymakers? Is it ignorance, selfishness, and pleasing the interests of companies involved in development and fossil fuel interests? I think the policymakers have values just like any of us have, and our values vary. What's important? Matt has a new baby, right? His values are going to be different than mine. I've got a 20-year-old that moved back in home. Okay. Thanks for the warning. Wish I'd talked to you earlier. Yeah. But I think what we need to do is, I think Codty said earlier, we need to find common ground. 50% of this country disagrees with how the other 50% votes, for example. That doesn't mean we can't have a good democracy, a good country, a good rational way of approaching these issues. It doesn't mean that we can't find common ground on things that affect the quality of life for all of us, whether we're residents or visitors here in Southwest Florida. So I think that's part of it, is just trying to find the common ground. And, again, environment should be a nonpartisan issue as far as I'm concerned. We all value the environment. It is the economy here in Southwest Florida. And so, I think that that's something that's important to keep in mind, that policymakers aren't enemies, for example. They're not ignorant of the issues. They're voting or making policies based on their values, and their values are different. So I think one of the things we need to do is, if environment is one of our values, we need to make sure that our policymakers, our decision makers, our elected officials know that, and know that loudly when you go to the poll, for example. Let's see. Is there evidence that marine species are adapting to warmer temperatures, or is it happening too fast? Anybody want to take that one on?
Anybody? So I would say that I don't think that most animals are able to adapt to this warming trend that we're experiencing. What we're seeing is an exacerbation on their normal activities. So most of what we encounter here is going to be spawning or migratory species, whether it's birds, fish, mammals. Because of this warming trend, we are seeing some abnormal behaviors. We can't constitute it as evolutionary trends of adaptability. It's more so that they're responding to environmental changes. There are a couple of, species that come to mind that could draw that line on adaptability or, evolving to partake in this. Common southern black racer that you see around your home, brown and knolls that have found a new establishment here, Cuban tree frogs. These are species that have a wide variety of tolerances that have found a new home, a new food source. They're able to fill that gap that the more complex species, unfortunately, are no longer able to be sustainable. So again, I don't know that they're able to exactly adapt to this increase, but it's something that they're able to do in the short term. And that's the best way I can answer that.
And a lot of what we see is migration and movement as well. Stanford University, for example, they've had a pier off the Hopkins lab at Monterey Bay for decades now, and they've seen tropical species marching north. For example, here in Florida, if you think about how many of you actually fish here in Florida, quite a few of you. So snook, bonefish, very, very temperature sensitive. They don't like freezes. So for example, when you get a hard freeze, that kind of determines the northern limit of snook, the snook population. It's the same with mangroves. You get a hard freeze of mangroves, and that's why they don't really find them north of Crystal River, right? So in some particular species case, you might actually see an increase in the habitat, but what you don't see is maybe temperatures at the equator are getting too hot for those exact same species, and it's causing a lot of physiological stress. But one of the things that we are seeing is at least they're adapting in that sense. They may not be evolving, but they're actually adapting in that sense by moving into cooler waters.
If I may, Greg, I started out my scientific career as a paleontologist, so and understand at least a little bit of evolutionary biology. That word adaptation has a different definition depending upon who's using it. When a biologist or ecologist is talking about adaptation, they're not talking about a behavioral change where an individual belonging to a species can, again, migrate or swim a little bit further north, or maybe trigger its reproductive activity as a flowering plant a little bit earlier in the spring, but rather how quickly can the genetics of a population change to handle those environmental stressors. Probably the best example that you're all familiar with of how adaptation is being made more difficult by a warming planet. Again, an evolutionary biologist's definition of adaptation deals with the corals that sit in the Florida Keys. You're all familiar with, again, the coral die-offs that we've been experiencing. There are species of corals that have historically been the reef builders, the constructors, the architects of those structures. Those species are just not doing well and are going extinct. And what's happening in the laboratory, just like you might be artificially selecting for a cow that makes more milk, there are biologists that are artificially selecting strains of those species of corals that appear to be more tolerant of warmer temperatures, and they're trying to plant those individuals in reefs to try to restore them. So that's basically humans playing God, if you will, influencing the genetics of a population to try to help those species, those reef building species, from avoiding extinction. So those are very different kinds of things. Anyway, that was my point, I guess.
Well, and I think what we're seeing is adaptation is not happening in a lot of these cases, whether it's rebuilding species. I think another great example is turtle. Turtle populations are shifting based on which sex is dominant in them because the turtle sex is determined by the temperature of the sand that their nest is in. So as we're seeing warmer temperatures, we're seeing many more female turtles than we otherwise would. And the populations aren't correcting, they're not adapting to being able to deal with these temperature shifts. We're just seeing one sex be much more dominant in the population. So I think we're going to see a lot more of these as we interact with species that aren't able to just swim further north or flower earlier, or come up with some other behavioral adaptation to these massive changes to their environment.
I think I've got one last question here. I think this is a good question to kind of end it all here. And I would encourage you to come up to the panelists and interact with them individually if you have other questions that didn't get answered, for example. And I appreciate Jim and Alan and Terry and the group here for putting this thing together for the Greater Estero community. I think these kind of things can be a model for what can go on in other communities. But to what extent will the impact of climate change on our visitors and the potential reduction on Florida's and Lee County's revenue be modeled to encourage lawmakers to take action more quickly?
I would say, the climate changes that have a main impact on the I'm going to say migration of people, but the variance of people. So right now, the main majority or the main reason that we attract so many people is the temperature, the sustainability. So during wintertime, we attract a lot of folks because we're not quite as cold as other portions of the United States. But as climate change is continuously starting to impact the entire globe, we may start to see a decrease in the amount of tourists that come to this area because there is no reason. There are certain areas of Russia inside of the tundra that are celebrating climate change because it's opening up so many more possibilities of areas for civilization. I think we're absolutely going to start to see that type of impact on the migration of people that move north and south that this entire economy is based around. So that would be the biggest imposing factor that I think would start to drive some change. We very well may see a decrease in the amount of tourism that we have here. So there was a statistic that came out, I think it was 2022, that RSW, our regional Southwestern airline, had up to 1 million passengers per year. Utilizing something like the airport could probably give us a pretty good idea of the demographic and the amount of folks that are coming and going. But climate change, I definitely think will have an impact on the main way that we make money here. So hopefully that applies to all lawmakers. So thank you.
Any other comments for the panel? What I would say, yes, in the back.
Sir, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I can't hear you.
On the west coast of Florida, talking about all problems of the coast migration and the island out. For example, I live in Naples, and Naples really is very wasn't very wide and how it feels on the coast, nor was Fort Myers Beach or Canada. What happened in the book to me was phenomenal. It made me decide where I was going to live and how I was going to live in Florida to protect myself from flooding and things like that. So I live in Naples, one of the highest houses in Naples, and 21.5 feet above sea level.
Woohoo.
And 18,000 years ago, it went to the end of the last ice age. The coastline, which we call, the west coast of Florida, was 150 miles out into the Gulf of Mexico. It's been moving towards Miami, towards the other coast, after we divided up by about 5 years. Anything that we're doing is impossible to stop. The ocean is going up because global warming now for 18 or 20,000 years. We may be speeding it up, but it's not going to change. I spend a lot of time, because that's one point which the other folks suffering is bad, but if we because the continental shelf is much narrower. I spent a lot of time recently in Galveston. Galveston is very interesting because it's got the same problems that Sanibel-Captiva, this island, very low, sea level. And then they had a hurricane went through Galveston in 1900, and there were 8,000 people that were killed in Galveston. And what did they do? They raised the island. They raised the island by about 16 or 17 feet. They had stone buildings that they lifted up. And there was a hurricane about 10 years afterwards. They propped up houses. It's building Galveston. Now you have to have laws, but they passed an ordinance for the whole city to raise it up. So there was a hurricane about 4 years or 6 years later, where only 6 or 7 people died compared to 8,000 before that. Probably better die.
So do you have a question?
Doing here in the west coast of Florida, looking at history will change. Is it going to change what we're doing? And we look at other parts of the country, for example, what Galveston did and how they protected themselves. Are we doing that? We're talking about local problems, but the ocean has been rising and will rise probably for at least another.
The ocean does not rise at the same rate, though, and that's been the issue. If the ocean didn't slow down in the rate that you were talking about, estuaries here on Southwest Florida wouldn't have formed about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. But Mike, you care to handle that?
Yeah, I mean, actually, your comment in some ways is brilliant. History is the great teacher, and that history predates human existence, and it's the geological record that can be used to determine how coasts have responded to climate change in the past. And one of the things that we've done here at FGCU for the Southwest Florida region is to develop what we call the sea level curve. How fast or slow has sea level gone up or down over the last 8,000 years of history since the last ice age? And when you look at that pattern, you're right, sea level has gone up through that entire time, but it has decelerated. The rate of rise has decelerated markedly right around 4,000, 3,500 years ago, and has been between that interval of time and the beginning of industrialization, it's been relatively low, coming up very, very slowly and near flat. And of course, it's now accelerated to a rate that exceeds the rate that we've experienced, or is equal to the rate we've experienced between 5,000 and 8,000 years ago. So now, over the last couple of centuries, we're experiencing a sea level rise rate that's comparable to what we experienced here between 5,000 and 8,000 years ago. And when you combine that sea level curve with the history of the coast's response, has it built seaward or prograded? Has it receded and moved backward? Between about right about that 4,000, 3,500 year mark, where sea level rise still going up, but slowly, that's when our coast built seaward. Okay, so we've actually experienced, since human occupation, right, since Native Americans have been here and Western civilization, our coastline has actually built seaward. All of those islands, Sanibel, Fort Myers Beach, the Spit in Naples, all of those are recent constructions within the last 3,000 years. What we're seeing now, as sea level rise is accelerating, those fronts are responding and receding and transgressing and moving backwards. So there is this not so subtle interplay between the rate at which sea level goes up and how the coast responds. And you're right, history does provide the valuable lessons. And that work's been done everywhere around the planet. It's not just a Southwest Florida thing. We can compare what we see here to what we see in the coast of Louisiana and Mississippi. Completely different situation there, because Mississippi, coastal Louisiana is actually sinking while sea level is going up. So their impacts are very, very different. We can compare it also with what happens on the Gulf Coast of Texas and with the Mid-Atlantic and with the East Coast of Florida. So that work is happening. Yeah, so thank you for that.
Thanks, Mike.
And the sea levels basically, they go up and down, like. I have 350, 450.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a whole nother problem of perception to deal with. I mean, the planet has gone through crazy climatic change and warming intervals long before humans ever existed. And the planet has gone through these what are called Milankovitch cycles, changing the orbital dynamics of the Earth relative to the sun, which has changed the amount of insolation we get. And that triggers major climatic change. The difference now, of course, is that the kind of climatic change we're experiencing can't be explained by those recurring cyclic phenomena. Anyway.
Yeah. I think a good sidebar, if you want to talk with Mike, that would be great. Again, we have many more questions to ask that were asked tonight than we can actually get to tonight. So Jim and Alan have informed me that they're going to be having another forum coming up that they will sponsor. We'd be happy to have it here that will cover a lot of the questions that remain unanswered tonight. Put your thinking caps on and remember what you wrote down, right? But also I think the focus in the next forum, it sounds like, will be on some of the practical solutions. What can we do? You know, it's easy to kind of get overwhelmed by the science, to get overwhelmed by the economics, to get overwhelmed by being impacted by a major storm, for example. I mean, a lot of our students are in tremendous anxiety and emotional stress right now because they may moved here from somewhere else where they don't have that kind of weather, and this is very disruptive to them as well. So anyway, there will be forums to come. So I'm going to invite Jim to come up and close this out tonight.
Okay, thank you. I think half the audience is gone. Usually happens that way though at the very end because they know I'm going to get up and speak. I just want to make a couple of comments. It isn't going to be long at all. As we conclude this forum, there's a lot of things become very clear. I think you'll agree with that. You know, that climate change poses a significant challenge. There are those who deny it, those who support it. Our discussions have highlighted the urgent need for action and the power you hold to unite as a community to affect change. I'll give you an example of this. To that end, Greater Estero, the Water School, Sanibel-Captiva Conservancy Foundation, and the Calusa Waterkeeper proposed hiring an environmental resource manager in the village of Estero to address municipal water quality and environmental challenges. Still, the village management did not see the value in the recommended position. Now, I'm not saying that to cut up the village. I'm saying that to support what was said by the panel here. The way to get this going is to get the villages, get the officials to start understanding that they have to listen to the people. You are the people. You're interested. You came here and spent a couple of hours of your time. You've heard what's happening now. You probably heard a lot of it earlier on. You've done your own research and study, and you probably have reached similar conclusions. But the bottom line is, from our perspective, we can't do that. That's not what Greater Estero is all about. Greater Estero is just what it says in the tagline. Our job is to inform you of what's going on, to encourage you to get engaged and make an impact. That's when it's going to happen, when the people come together and they approach their council people and they approach the commissioners and they go to these meetings and they make it very clear they're not happy with certain things that are happening. That's when you'll start to see some of the change. That's when it's going to happen, no other time. So finally, I want to thank Dr. Tolley. Did a great job on this, and the panel members. Thank you very much. Hang around, don't go away when I get off. They really did a great job. They understand this business. They have significant knowledge on what we've talked about. We've explored the impacts of rising temperatures, the sea levels, the importance of sustainable practices, and the need for community education. That's what you heard tonight. We also thank you for your interest and participation. Your insights and extraordinary commitment to making a difference is very important. You're interested because of this. You all had so many questions that we couldn't answer. And as Greg said, we're going to try to come back with a part 2 and part 3 on this, where we'll explore the educational side of it. We'll take all these questions and start to pull together that'll help us formulate what the whole concept will be of the next forum and so on. So it won't be a waste. So we're really happy that you came, but now is the moment to transform this energy into some action. That's what it's all about. You can leverage this momentum to champion a sustainable environment in the future for all of us. Each of you has the power to create lasting change, and your participation is vital. Until next time, good night.